Good afternoon, everyone. I'm so glad to see so many people interested in this topic. My name is Dashi Lacey. I do diversity and governance work with the Pillar Nonprofit Network. And I'm really excited to be navigating through this webinar with you, moderating it as well as I can. So excited about this topic. It's, while this work began last fall, in two classes, given the current circumstances, this makes it even more topical. While you might have issues related to racism and anti-discrimination, are always important topics, but in a pandemic world, we are learning just how much COVID-19 is disproportionately affecting communities that are marginalized. And through this whole process too, with the Black Lives Matter movement being much more active in terms of as a social justice movement, this is really, really topical. So I'm very pleased actually that we're having this conversation today, because I think it's important to know that, London does have a sad history of racism, tracing back to slavery and segregation. So these are important things to keep in mind as we listen to our panelists today. To begin with, I'd like to start, as we always do with many of our sessions, acknowledging in gratitude the land upon which we are. So we'd like to acknowledge the indigenous people whose traditional territory we have gathered on today. This land was once settled by the Arawandaran peoples, later the Anishinaabe people and Haudenosaunee people, who used these lands as their traditional hunting grounds. The three long-standing indigenous groups of this region are the Anishinaabe people, including the Ojibwe, Ottawa, and Potawatomi nations, the Haudenosaunee peoples, including the Mohawk, Oneida, Cayuga, Onondaga, Seneca, and Tuscarora nations, and the Lenni Lenape people, also referred to as the Delaware or Munsee. It's also important to recognize the three First Nations communities that neighbor the City of London: Chippewa of the Thames First Nation, Oneida Nation of the Thames, and the Munsee Delaware Nation. I would like at this moment also to acknowledge the many long-standing treaty relationships between Indigenous nations and Canada. We recognize that all levels of government in Canada have a responsibility to honor the nation-to-nation relationship, and that as importantly as individuals, we have a role to play in honoring the treaties and contributions to reconciliation. I acknowledge my role as a settler and that I benefit from the continuing colonization of these lands. I recognize my responsibility for reconciliation. Pillar Nonprofit Network recognizes the inequities connected to colonization and commit to working towards creating a just, inclusive, and vibrant community for all. Welcome to this meeting, and thank you so much for being with us. I'm going to just pause for 10 seconds for us to have a moment of reflection. Thank you. So to get us started today, we're going to, just to remind you that this is a webinar format. So you can see us, but those of us who you see are people all engaged in speaking today. We can't see you. We will have an opportunity, and you can start posting your questions as you have them in the chat. They will be anonymous, so we won't know who you are. The webinar is being recorded. You may have noticed that. I also want to introduce Sarah, who is here as our graphic recorder. Thanks, Sarah, for the session. And we might pause at different points for us to see what she has been recording as we go along. So with that, I am going to hand it off to Misha, who will speak a little bit and introduce CityStudio.
Thanks, Darshi. My name is Misha Schlemmer, and I'm the manager of CityStudio London. CityStudio is a model of experiential learning that started in Vancouver in 2011, and in London we launched in 2019. Our program is run by Pillar Nonprofit Network, and we're a partnership between the City of London and our 5 post-secondary institutions. So that's King's University College, Fanshawe College, Huron University College, Western University, and Brescia University College. And in our first year, we had 21 projects where we took strategic projects from the City of London and we matched them with existing courses on the 5 post-secondary campuses to be able to carry out these projects within the academic expertise of the course. And so today we're going to be talking about one of those courses. And we're really excited to actually get to work on this project after it finished in the semester. So the participants will speak a little bit more about how this all came to be. But in our first year, we had over 400 students participate. I would invite you to check out our website at citystudiolondon.ca, where you can find out more about all of the projects that participated this year. You can also learn about the courses that are partnering with CityStudio in the coming year if you want to get involved with the CityStudio course. You can also volunteer with CityStudio. You can give us feedback there. You can follow some of our media, the news articles about CityStudio. And I also encourage you to follow us on social media. Our handle is CityStudio LDN, and there you can follow the projects as they're happening, as well as these types of events that can happen about the projects afterwards as well. So we're really excited to have the opportunity to share more about this project today, especially as Darshi mentioned, this is such a critical time where we really have collective awareness focused on this really critical issue. And so we want to really take the time to showcase the work that the students and the city partners and faculty have been working on so far. And at the end of the session, we'll also talk about next steps for if you want to move further into this work, how you can get involved further. So thank you very much. And I think I am passing off next to Kinga and Ramina from the City of London, who are going to just share a little bit about the project and how it came to be, and what their experience was of working on the project. Thank you.
Thank you, Misha, for the introduction. So hi, everyone. My name is Kinga. I work at the City of London as the support staff for the Diversity Inclusion Strategy. So today I'll just provide you a little bit of a background on the strategy and how did we get involved in this project. So the Community Diversity Inclusion Strategy is a community-led strategy which is supported by the city. Within the strategy, we have 5 priorities focused on different areas of diversity inclusion within the city. So we have a priority 1, which is focused on reconciliation, 2, oppression and discrimination, number 3, focuses on engagement, 4, focuses on accessibility, and 5, on employment. The strategy was created back in 2017 by 200 Londoners, which came together over the course of 3 months to create all the contents within that strategy. So everything that you will read and see in there is created by Londoners. And right now we're in the process of implementing the strategy. So within those 5 priorities, we have 5 working groups, which all have volunteers assigned to them. And each working group has a chair. And Ramina, who will be speaking after me, is the chair of priority 2, which focuses on discrimination and oppression. And that is where this project lands in. One of their strategies is focused on different forms of discrimination. So how we got involved in this project, we actually worked with the previous year's class on kind of on identifying the different forms of discrimination within London. So we arrived on 4, which we focused last year on. So Stalinism, ableism, xenophobia, and racism. And today you'll be hearing about the research on racism. And we also got involved in CityStudio because we saw it as a benefit to the community. You will get a completely different perspectives from students, and it also gives them the opportunity to learn and get involved in real life projects that are affecting our communities and kind of learning about the community, and gives them great experience, I think. So I am a very big supporter of this project. So I'm just going to pass it off to Ramina to get into more detail about the project.
Hi, everyone, and thank you. So my name is Ramina. I am the chair, as Kinga said, of one of the 5 priorities. So mine is, the title of it is to have zero tolerance for oppression, discrimination, and ignorance. And under that priority, we have 14 different strategies that we are tasked with implementing. And so we sort of narrowed down to like the top 5 that we think we can actually have some action on. And one of them is very much about the isms, as Kinga had said. And we found this opportunity to work with the students really helpful, because our working group is made up of volunteers. They are well-meaning Londoners who have either lived experience or are working in the field of equity and inclusion and are really wanting to see things change and to be different. And so they bring their experience, but they bring it in a sense of a volunteer. And so when you think about having zero tolerance for discrimination, oppression, and ignorance, I mean, that can't be done in 2 hours a month by anybody, even if we got all of the City of London to be involved. And so, and we kind of knew that as we went in. And we want to ground our action. So we've been tasked with these strategies, but we almost need some sense of current situation to sort of ground our work in and to guide us. And so, as Kinga said, this strategy was developed in 2017. We're now in 2020. So much has changed just in the last 8 months. But as this project, we wouldn't have known it, but how relevant it would be for right now. But it aligned really well for us to have the students in their own learning start to identify what is the temperature in London, what are people feeling? And they did a really great job of getting some experiences through surveys and focus groups to enrich the information that we already know exists. So kind of comparing that with statistics from census information and allowing, so that information has allowed us to kind of look at where are the gaps in terms of communities that are feeling very marginalized, and how can we do better, and how can we take those action items that we've been tasked with and make them really fit with where the need is. As much as this was created by 200 Londoners, 200 people really isn't everybody. And so, and we have recognized also we don't have a huge youth voice at our table. And so this is a really nice way to kind of bring the youth perspective and the keenness that comes with that in terms of learning. That's really helped to embed some of the work that we're going to do moving forward. So it's a really natural fit for us to be able to take that research and then build on it and allow it to inform and incorporate some of their work into our work so that it aligns nicely and that we're all sort of moving in the same direction, and that direction is defined by the community. So that's the gist of what we're doing and why we're working with the students. And I'm going to be honest, I don't know who I'm handing it off to. Sorry. Can somebody
That's
help
okay.
me?
I'm going to ask Kim to maybe.
Kim is going to step in. Thank you.
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
Am I good? I'm not sure I'm actually next. Am I next, Misha?
Yeah, that would be great. If you could just kind of speak a little bit about how the project came into the classroom and what that was like. Yeah.
Okay, so so I'm Kim Sulga. I'm one of the instructors that participated in last year's iteration of this project. I teach a class at Western called Performance Beyond Theaters, which is part of our core theater studies module, but it's actually a class about the way performance operates in everyday life. So instead of thinking about just performance on the stage and just theater as art, we think about performance as a grounding in our bodies, performance as a way that we make public space. We think about everything from sports to political speeches to protests, to street fairs. So if you stop and think about the last few months, especially in terms of Black Lives Matter and all of the worldwide protests after the George Floyd killing, it's probably fairly easy to visualize how performance and social justice actions can collide. So this is actually something that that drew us to the project. So my colleague in psychology, Leora Schwartzman, and her students performed qualitative research to talk to members of the working groups and champions from Kinga's side at the city, and to get a sense of lived experience of discrimination here in London. And they brought data, research not only from the community, but also from their reading and learning as community psychology students to my students in my class. And my students' job was then to animate the data and imagine performance actions or community theater events that could help to instruct Londoners, help in a joyful way, in a compelling way, in a moving way, help Londoners to understand and even embody what going through a discriminatory experience might be like. Originally, we'd planned to do a series of live actions downtown as part of the CityStudio, my goodness, Misha, whatever it was called, the wonderful CityStudio gathering that was planned for April. And then of course, COVID got in the way. But luckily, once again, performance came to the rescue, because one of the forms of action that my students had been studying is called an audio walk. And there are lots of examples of these around the world that are used both for art purposes and also for protest purposes. So the students ended up making a series of audio events that encouraged participants to move through the experience that someone suffering racism or suffering ableism or saneism or xenophobia might go through. So those events are chronicled on a web page that's linked to our project page on CityStudio's website, and I would love for anyone interested to go and have a look. And this year's class is going to do very much the same thing, only we're going to be working with Romina and working with Leora's students again. We're going to be focusing particularly on anti-Black and anti-Indigenous racism. And I'm very pleased to introduce my colleague and student teaching assistant, Sheetala Bhatt, who's going to be joining us. And I just wanted Sheetala to say a few words about her research, because it's specifically to do with these topics and quite groundbreaking.
Thank you very much.
Go for it.
Hi, I'm Sheetala. I'm the teaching assistant for Kim's course. I'm from India. I worked as a theater artist in India, especially in community theater, street feminist performances, as well as regional language theater. My doctoral dissertation is a study of cultural performance of love in relation to Indigenous people on Turtle Island and in India. So I'm looking at how to think about solidarity across Global South and Global North and different ways of colonization and anti-colonial resistance. And I'm also involved in research projects that are exploring how to be a good ally to Indigenous and Black resistance through performance studies lens. I'm very excited to be working with Kim on this course and working with CityStudio. Thank you.
Thanks. I think we're good, Misha. I don't know who I'm handing off to.
Okay, that's okay, Kim. I'll take it. Thank you so much, Kim and Sheetala. That's fascinating, and I really look forward to listening to and hearing the student presentation. So at this point, I am going to hand it off to 3 students who are part of Leora Schwartzman's class. Leora, unfortunately, was not able to be here today, but sent good wishes yesterday for the session today. So I'm not sure if you're going in this sequence, but I'm going to see the sequence that's on my agenda. And I would just ask that you sort of introduce yourself as well before you start speaking to the subject that you picked. So my sequence is Kieran, Camille, and Vanessa.
And you are correct in that. Hi, everyone. My name is Kieran. My pronouns are he, they, and thank you all for coming and spending your Thursday afternoon with us. I see there's over 50 of you here, and that's really, really exciting to see. So each one of us kind of have an area of expertise that we kind of focused on when looking at the project and when conducting this project with the CDIS champions and the City of London. So each of us are just going to take about 5 minutes to go through kind of what we focused on, and then we can definitely talk a lot more about it in sort of the Q&A portion. Or if we say something interesting, please feel free to ask more, because we have a lot of data. We had about an 80-page report that we produced. So definitely this is by no means exhaustive and just kind of the tip of the iceberg. So what I'm really going to be focusing on is disarming microaggressions and talking a little bit more about interpersonal discrimination. Now, before even starting to talk about that, I think I need to position myself. Obviously, I am a white individual. I am approaching this subject a lot more from my own experiences as a sort of a bystander and a white ally and things like that. So a lot of what I'm going to be talking about today, while I think it is applicable to individuals who are experiencing racism themselves, I just want to keep that in mind, that a lot of my own experiences will come through in what I'm saying. And that is definitely a little bit more from the position of someone who is white and who is intervening as a bystander in these situations. So I think when getting into the actual content of, disarming microaggressions, I think we first need to discuss, how do Canadians actually talk about race? Because that's often what, that's the first thing that you have to do, is bring up the idea of race, bring to the forefront what is communicated by these actions, these everyday insults and things like that that are just hurled around and stuff like that. And I think one thing we need to be clear about is just the ways that Canadians talk about race. And I want to say, it's not even just, I don't want to broaden it to Canadians. I think we need to be more pointed and talk about the fact that it's dominant narratives that are predominantly created by our white media sphere and by our institutions that uphold white supremacy and things like that. So one of the big things that is often perpetuated is this idea of Canada as an angel. It's an angel complex. We like to compare ourselves to the United States and say we're not them. And basically in doing that, it often negates the fact that, slavery did happen in Canada. We continue to perpetuate a genocide against Indigenous people and things like that. And so oftentimes we do not recognize that race continues to be a very salient social identity within the Canadian landscape. And often this is done under the guise of this discourse of multiculturalism, where we continue to sort of neutralize differences, in which we just celebrate everyone for, their different backgrounds and their cultures. But at the same time, this discourse of multiculturalism and diversity often replaces dialogues around anti-racism, equity, and affirmative action that are really, really critical, recognizing the state of, Canadian society, which continues to be very inequitable. And the problem with this is that it very much continues to perpetuate sort of this post-racial or colorblind lens that we continue to view racial disparities and problems of race, in that we continue to see race not as a sort of significant site of struggle, and not as something that continues to, inform lived experience, but also inform and determine life outcomes. And so I think it's just important to kind of position ourselves understanding this, because this is really going to impact how we how we talk about race and how we intervene when racial discrimination does occur. And so especially as, an ally, oftentimes you might be asking, am I making a problem out of nothing? Am I being disruptive in, putting myself out there and, intervening or calling someone out and stuff like that? And it's because, again, this idea of, making a colorblind society or a very multicultural and diverse society that often, does not really affirmatively attack things like power and stuff like that. The problem with it is it creates an environment for a lot of racial gaslighting and things like that. And so it's really important to just recognize that off the bat. And that really allows for us to kind of think further about, the fact that disruption is important in a system reliant on inequality that at the same time it denies the existence of. And so just to get a little bit into sort of the idea of a microaggression and sort of interpersonal racism, the idea of a microaggression is not to minimize these actions, but it's just to say that they're between individuals. And that's why I say also interpersonal racism. And it's really important because a lot of what we heard from the CDIS champions was that racism in Canada is very subtle. It happens, it's very pervasive, but it's very subtle. It's just these subtle biases, these subtle actions, these subtle slights that individuals have about individuals, or like they might make a joke that they don't realize is racially insensitive or racially targeted and things like that. And the problem is that whether they're intentional or not, these things, again, they have an impact, and there's an aggregate impact that Vanessa will definitely talk about later when we talk a little bit more about sort of the mental health impact of racism. And it's important because a lot of times these microaggressions are both socialized, but also they're everyday behaviors. And so we oftentimes don't really think twice about what we're doing or what we're communicating through what we're saying and what we're thinking and things like that. And so when it comes to disarming microaggressions and really targeting them, I think one really important thing is differentiating between intent and impact. Oftentimes the champions talked about how people will respond saying, you know, it was a joke, or I didn't mean it like that. But the problem is that regardless of what you intend, like, we can't prove that you intended to do one thing or the other. It's having an impact on that racialized person. And it is, you know, again, making these areas and making these environments unsafe for them, but also making them disempowering. And so it's really, really important often to just differentiate that. So there's no way to easily just like get yourself out of that situation. Like, you need to take responsibility for what you're saying and what you're doing. Now, when really targeting and disarming a microaggression, there's kind of three main or key things that I really found was really interesting that came out of kind of what we were working on. And that is, again, making the invisible visible. And so what I mean by that is often, again, microaggressions are everyday behaviors we don't think twice about. So it's finding ways to communicate, like, you know, what you just did was not okay and is not appropriate. And you need to become more critical of what you're communicating with what you're doing. So saying, you know, you assumed that I couldn't do something because of the color of my skin, or, you know, did you realize what you just said? Or even just giving a slight look in people's experiences have often, you know, allowed for individuals to be like, hey, like, what did I just do? Or like, what did I just say? Like, I've said this thing for years, but now it's a problem. And it's just like little things that allow for people to become a little bit more conscious, a little more critical of what they're doing and what they're saying and what they're communicating through those actions. The second thing that I really sometimes like to use personally, because I see it as a less threatening way to go about it, is really referencing an offender's values. Talking about how, you know, I know you to be a really, really caring person, or I know you to care about social justice, or I know you to be socially oriented and things like that. But, you know, what you just did didn't necessarily translate to that. So really trying to, again, come across as, you know, understanding that this individual might not even know what they're doing or might not intend what they're doing, but, you know, what you're doing is not really the person I think that you want to be and stuff like that. And that, in my personal experience, has been very effective, because oftentimes, you know, no one wants to be called a racist. And oftentimes when we do try to disarm, you know, a microaggression, that's the first thing that an individual's brain goes right to. And then number 3 is just promoting empathy. And so just recognizing, this is also something I think we've, a lot of people have been told, is just, you know, communicating that, you know, like, how would you feel if someone said this to you? Or how would you feel if someone had this assumption, or, you know, decided to take this action as a result of, you know, X, Y, Z. And just to start closing it off, I think one thing in taking in this information about, you know, how to disarm a microaggression, it's really important to recognize we don't want to become saviors. That's not the intention here. The intention here is not to, you know, learn all this information, take it all in, and now become a warrior and just go out and, you know, call people out left, right, and center. Because when it comes down to these conversations aren't about us, especially as white allies. It's all about, you know, being there and supporting individuals who are on the, you know, a receiving end of these actions. It's being cognizant of the fact that, you know, we have to be actively anti-racist, and figuring out what the nuance is to doing so, and being hyper aware of, you know, like, when someone might, you know, indicate they need, you know, some assistance, or they want you to step in, or, you know, maybe they don't want. And that really brings me to the fact that context does matter. The fact that, you know, you need to pick your battles, not only because there's a lot of emotional labor involved with doing this, but also the fact that, you know, the priority when you are intervening is you want to make sure that the individual on the receiving end of a microaggression is safe. If you or your intervention is going to put them in danger, or potentially the environment that it's in might cause, you know, the perpetrator to be upset or potentially violent, that's not the situation where you want to be stepping in. And with that, you also need to recognize the relationship both you and potentially the individual on the receiving end has with the perpetrator, and how that can inform how you go about it, right? Many times people will often say, you know, it's very difficult to intervene when it's like with a family member. You have a very specific relationship with them, and it sometimes can be very uncomfortable, whereas, you know, a stranger can be a lot different. You don't have as many social ties or things, you know, on the line when you are, you know, intervening in a situation such as that. And now, just to basically close off what I'm saying, I'm just going to share a little thing in the chat, which is basically a toolkit with a number of great examples of kind of everything that I kind of went over today. And it has really great examples for different contexts and different situations and stuff like that. So I would encourage you to take a look at it. It's from the Southern Poverty Law Center, and I will just link it in the chat. And now I just want to pass it over to Camille.
Thank you, Kieran. Hi guys, thanks for coming. So I'm the second student in the Psychology 3895 class to research racism. My name is Camille, and my area of expertise is around the types of cultural competence interventions that should be implemented in London. So according to the CDIS, intercultural competence helps us understand how our culture or cultures influence our values and the way that we behave around people of other cultures. Now, it's important here to remember that becoming culturally competent doesn't require learning about the do's and don'ts of how to behave around people from various cultures. Rather, what it does is it provokes an attitudinal shift as a person who is culturally competent comes to recognize that there are no naturally correct views or ways of life, which then in turn allows him to appreciate the subjectivity of life experiences and embrace the diversity around him. So in other words, it's a lifelong process of coming to terms and learning about the cultures that are around you in your respective environment, and just kind of growing and learning about the different ways that people go about doing things and the different perspectives. So we perceive racial differences because we categorize people in two ways, as in-group members and out-group members. In-group members are those people that we affiliate with, whether that be because we share similar values or lineage, whereas out-group members are those people whom we don't affiliate with. When we then use these psychological categorizations to determine how we place on the social hierarchy relative to our out-group peers. Now, the reason that I said all of this is that research in developmental psychology has found that an average child does all of this categorization and placement on the social hierarchy before the age of 5. And the reason that they can do this is because media oftentimes provides us with the first exposure to our outgroups that gives us an understanding of how people from various races are. So what this does is that we don't need to interact with people of other races in order to have an image of how they are. And ultimately what this does is perpetuate stereotypes. And this is the big factor that contributes to our unconscious biases. And this is evident in just saying, you know, I'll ask you fill in the blank, Asians are something, and you will immediately come to terms with something in your head because these messages are just so pervasive within our society. So what this does ultimately is plays a big role in perpetuating these biases within us at an early age. And what happens is research has found that children who come into school already hold these racial biases in place. And this is why one of the actions that I stressed the most was to focus on integrating cultural competence interventions into the elementary school curricula, because that's when children are first introduced to and exposed to people of other races. And that's when bullying and those sorts of overt sorts of discrimination can start to happen. So many effective interventions in the classroom that work to foster cultural competence do so through play and intergroup contact. And play allows a child to touch, see, and or taste the artifacts or cuisine of other cultures that helps them feel more connected. Play is also very special because it allows you to question without bounds, where lots of studies have found that children through play question their own biases about a certain culture that help them understand why their biases are misinterpretations. And another way that you can reduce prejudice in the classroom is to facilitate intergroup contact. So a teacher could set up an activity that has students teamed up in intimate group settings and working collectively on a problem at equal status, where this has proven to develop cultural competence because it allows the people to see one another less for their superficial differences and more as a common humanity. And it's really important that we not undermine the power of fostering this collectiveness, because when we're under stress, we engage in outgroup avoidance, where we become more fearful and disgusted of our outgroup members. And it's really interesting because this is a biological mechanism. It's something that is programmed into us when there's times of uncertainty. And this is ultimately why we see the rise in anti-Chinese sentiment. People are unsure of what to believe and who to trust. And it's ultimately that social trust that erodes these sort of interpersonal relations and creates these divides in society. So especially during times like this, it's important that we remember that we're more similar to one another than we make out to be. We're having these sort of intimate experiences with people or objects from other cultures early on in our life really helps us give a clear image of this and helps us reduce this sort of prejudice that we may hold during times of uncertainty. So lastly, what I wanted to say is the biggest takeaway that I got from being a part of this project is that I will never understand the cumulative experiences of a racialized person, as I myself am not one. And I think this is really important because as people who are privileged, or as people who don't fit the mold of being able to express lived experiences, throughout this class, I found it a bit of a struggle to be able to assert my position or say that I can say anything for that matter, because it's there's sort of a political correctness to go about talking about race. But I'm extremely happy to be engaged in this project, and I think that with all in this group, we all had different experiences and different perspectives, and it's really important that we value these sort of differing experiences and ways of looking at such issues in society, and also just keeping our ears open and listening to those voices that have been diminished is very important, because we all live in a society that works to diminish some people while uplifting others, and it's important that we all know that we have to be doing the right thing. So thank you, and I will be passing it on to Vanessa.
You're on mute, Vanessa.
Vanessa, you're on mute.
Sorry. Thank you, Camille. So my name is Vanessa, and I go by she or her. So before I start going about my piece of the project, which was mostly systemic racism and engagement, I just wanted to kind of do a self-reflexive exercise about my own intersection. So I am a Black woman, like you all can see, and I'm also an immigrant, first-generation immigrant and first-generation student. And I will say that having this racialized embodiment helped me to understand, or helped me to kind of relate to the lived experience of racialized Londoner that we were able to collect through this project. So my focus or my area of expertise, like I said, during this project was systemic racism. And our research project and the consultation that we had with the CDS champion revealed that racialized Londoner experience pressing structural barriers when it comes, for example, to employment or mental health services. I think it's really relevant to what is happening right now. And as a racialized person myself, I really want us to understand what are the underlying reason or issue that are going in our institution, and what can be the mental burden that racialized people carry on. So according to Statistics Canada, the unemployment rate is twice higher for racialized Londoner, and racialized women in London on average make 35% less than non-racialized men. To me, this speaks a lot to the work we still have ahead of us, but also to the mix of sexism and racism in London. This is why it's so important in this work to adopt an intersectional lens. One other thing related to mental health in now is that health inequality statistic in 2016 mentioned that racialized people in Ontario rated the mental health more poorly than did non-racialized people. The finding of a research project actually revealed that racism has a direct and crippling effect on the mental health of racialized Londoner. They experience a combination of skepticism, devaluation, discrimination, especially in the workplace. For example, some Londoners talked about being discriminated against by the customer because of people's expectation of what type of job they ought to do. So my question is, how then can we expect racialized people to achieve wellness or to fully live their lives in London when they constantly experience distress related to racism? I think we should strive to the best of ability to do this work with a thorough understanding of those forces that brought us here in the first place, like Dashi said at the beginning, colonization, or even an history of and a legacy of segregation in London. So sustainable change in London needs to be from the top down, as mentioned by the CDS champion. The problem, though, is that what happened when the leaders lack cultural awareness or cultural humility or cultural competency? We all have blind spots and unconscious biases that we carry on, as Camille explained it so well. And it usually starts at a really, really early stage of our life. And the social identity theory, for example, explained that we self-assign ourselves to social group, whether in group or out group, based on race, cultural background, or socioeconomic status. And we form these unconscious biases based on this self-identification. Even those of us who are the most pro-equity are susceptible to the formation of those blind spots. And if they are unchecked, we become complicit to maintain these invisible structural barriers in our institution. So we recommend, first of all, for all of us to develop cultural humility and to recognize that we don't know everything, or that our culture is not the only one or the best one. Another thing that we suggest is to actively work at diversity and inclusion everywhere, every spaces that we are involved in. We can enact strategy like hiring intentionally for diversity, or appoint a diversity officer, or create a diversity office whose mandate would be to identify structural barrier and operational biases within our organization. And I think the example of the at Western University with the anti-racism working group, it's really speak to this last point. We can also invest in developing cultural competency program, or we can also develop specific outreach initiative or ethnic specific services that are geared toward racialized community and their needs. One thing that actually really came out of the research project, speaking specifically to the need of racialized community when it comes to mental health, is that sometimes racialized people, whether they are immigrant or newcomer, or they've been living in for generation after generation, often they lack knowledge of mental health resources available in the neighborhood or in the community. So really sometimes it boils down to simple action like outreach initiative. On the other end, a few weeks ago, we have witnessed the amount of young people and young adults from all backgrounds who came alongside Black Lives Matters. I think we need to invest in raising the critical consciousness of the youth, especially those aged 15 years old and plus. Why is that so important? I think they sincerely desire to learn and to make London a more inclusive city. They form 13% of London's population. This is as of 2016, and it keeps growing. We need to direct them and to address the concern, because there's a lot of confusion out there. For example, we can teach them how to be effective bystander. And I think that Kieran did a good job explaining how to design microaggression. Those are kind of strategy we can enact. We can also help them to become more confident in themselves enough to speak out when they witness racism. We can use, for example, social media platform, or develop and implement brave spaces that challenges their biases. And what I like with brave spaces is that they offer the advantage for perspective taking, for storytelling, and for intergroup contact, which are strategies so crucial to remove the structural barrier or the impact of racism in our daily life. Brave spaces also offer a platform for the youth to build relationship with other youth who do not look like them, right? So one other thing, and I think that has been mentioned early by Karen, is that most people in London are either silent or in denial about the issue of racism in London. These correspond to the first stages of social identity development, where most people are either naive or they accept those inequalities, or sometimes they even try to justify them. For example, you can think, oh, Black people lack intelligence, which explain why they do not perform well in school, or which explain why they are unemployed or underemployed. We want Londoners to transition from lower level of understanding, where they deny, where they are silent, when they finger point or blame other people, to higher level of critical consciousness and action, where they can actually produce potential for transformational change in our city. And we believe this is a win-win for everyone in London. More importantly, I think personally this leads to empowerment. When I look at my own story of moving to London, of being part of a project like CityStudio, and being part of this racism project, I think when you decide to use your freedom to make the choice to not become complacent and to enact positive change around you, it leads to increased feeling of empowerment. So personally, this is how I feel. And I feel like this specific project empowered me in so many ways. It happened through increased resilience, it happened to racial dialogue, it happened to a better racial understanding, but it also happened to citizenship participation. So whether you are listening to us right now or you'll be watching the video, the recorded video after, I will really engage you or call you to action. You can join the CDIS project as a student like we did, or you can join the CDIS project as a volunteer, or you can join anything that's related to diversity and inclusion strategy in London. So thank you very much, and I will now pass the lead to Tino.
So I wondered, go ahead, Chino, actually. Why don't you go ahead, and then we'll call on Sarah to show us a little bit about the graphic recording that she's done.
Okay, so hi everyone, my name is Chino. It's from cappuccino, so last 5 letters, just to let you know. I'm in Kim's performance theater class, and I am in the group of racism with my teammates, Reese, Brittany, and Paul. Unfortunately, they're not able to make it today, so I'll take their credits. Sorry, guys. And I'll be the representative for our project. So we work pretty closely with Karen, Camille, and Vanessa. If you say there's a lens that records the facts, then we are the projectors to show what they see. And they're focusing on recording what is happening in London community, and our research is on performance methods. And to be more specific, it's about what types of performance are more persuasive and acceptable by the public when we're talking about racism. And our goal was to enhance and illustrate the research findings in nuanced ways. And we want to have our listeners reflect meaningfully on racism, both locally and globally, and also provide with the knowledge and tools to be upstanders in the community who can call out racism and form an inclusive community in London of better understanding and more upstanders. And over the course of the project, we made an additional goal, which is to situate the research findings in relation to COVID-19, because during that time, COVID was dominating our national and international news. A prominent theme in those stories are anti-Asian discrimination, which was evident there here in Canada and especially pronounced in the States, especially when Donald Trump referred to COVID-19 as the China virus, though he's still calling that. But anyways, also we realized that social distancing can be used as a useful method of being able to experience a dose of what it is like to be marginalized and othered, and not have the entire world open to you. So that's how we connect both together. And in the beginning, we were planning to make the performance in a documentary form, interspersed with immersive theater, but due to COVID-19, all the things move online, so we need to pre-film. And eventually we went with podcast, incorporated verbatim theater. And fun facts about verbatim theater is a form of theater in which plays are constructed from the precise words spoken by people interviewed about a particular event or topic. And the song we sing in the podcast, yeah, we created a song, and as well as a panel discussion between Leora, Kim, and champions are all directly quoted from the transcript that collected by Karen's group. Thanks guys for your hard working. And so they're all true stories of racism in the London community. Also, we put some of our own experience in it. And I have to say that the entire creative process was torturous, but it did somehow change me, because at the beginning, as a visible minority in Canada, I know how it feels when people get discrimination, and it happens a lot. And I believed by that time that people who would easily make mean comments on others was because they never experienced such a thing themselves, because human joys are serious and not connected. And if we wanted to draw people's attention and let them notice that it was really hurtful when people get judged by their race, the best way was to let people experience it. So I came up with an idea that shouting out racist words to strangers based on their race and see how they react. But it got rejected because it was not safe and not smart either. Plus, after the meeting with Karen, Camille, and Vanessa, and other members in their groups, we suddenly realized that the problem may not be the racist people, but those who do not mean to be racist, because it's more dangerous when people are doing this unconsciously. And that's why in our podcast, we show tons of examples about unconscious racism comments and mean to draw people's attention and let the public know that, hey, I know you didn't mean that, but it really hurts. And so overall, our project aims to point out some behaviors or words that may cause people feel discriminated and highlight some typical cases. And also at the end, we include some call out actions to give the public a starting point about how to avoid racism and how to become upstanders. So, so for now, I'd like to share our song with you guys. I guess most of the people haven't heard the song yet. Yeah, so hope you guys can enjoy it. Let me test my audio first.
All I have to offer is my extensive knowledge of musical theater. This is
okay. Can anybody hear that? Okay, great.
My time to shine. DJ, hit it. I see that you're not from here. Safe for now that you're in Canada. You don't even see how they feel. It's despicable. Sucks to see that people haven't changed. Open your eyes, let's dive in. Yes, it really is. It's racist. Take it in. A lot of cold snow when you're moving to Ontario. What can I say except you're racist, a discriminatory guy. It's not okay that you're racist. And I guess I'm sort of wondering why. Hey, tell us, are you black, are you white? Come on, that's not right. Spite. When you needed songs, you stole the tunes, man, that was low. Looking at you. Oh, also you promised a wall. You're racist, expecting that you're back and call. Swimming in your pool of gold. You're racist, a trumpet's getting really old. So what can I say except you're racist? It's just really bothering me. It's still not okay, you're racist. You say it's just my individuality. No, that's racist. You're racist. Well, come to think of it, guys, honestly, I could go on and on. I could explain every type of racism. Overt, subtle, micro, the things in between, beyond cultural. I don't work in customer service. Wear a hijab, you'll make them nervous. What's the lesson? What is the takeaway? Don't mess with our culture, racist, they like to say. Racism, microaggression, washed away self-esteem from within. Look what we've been, feels like everything's happened. Just look at our new little president, just laughing and laughing and laughing and hey. Well, anyway, let me say you're racist to this wonderful world we know. And it's not okay, you're racist. And come to think of it, you've gotta go. Hey, it's my day to say you're racist to this great big world that we know. And it's not okay, you're racist. And come to think of it, you've gotta go. You're racist. You're racist. No, thank you.
A little bit pause to our talented Brittany, who wrote the song and who also the singer for the song. And yeah, so that's kind of like a small demo for our project. If you're really interested in the project, please visit our website and you can go through the whole podcast. So now I'm going to hand the micro to Sarah, and let's see what she gets so far, I guess.
Thank you, Sarah. You're good too. Just before we go into Sarah, I just want to say thank you to all of you for your presentations. It's amazing that you've sort of captured for me, I'm sort of listening to it from a addressing this issue on a personal basis in terms of stepping up to be brave, to deal with microaggressions, to understanding the context of cultural competence and where that is learned in the schools, and then leading to Vanessa's talking about the whole systemic thing and how do you mobilize people to address these issues, and then Chino converting it all into this wonderful presentation that included the song. So I'm excited to actually share that with all of my colleagues within Pillar as well. So I'm going to, before we go into the Q&A, I thought if Sarah, if you wouldn't mind sharing what you've been very busy. See you working away while this is going on. So you can just share it, or if you want to speak to some of it right now, I'm just going to give you the floor for a bit.
Okay, well, thank you for having me. And I felt like there was so much, so obviously I didn't get to capture everything, but I really appreciated what everybody had to say. I think the things that really popped up for me was the idea of Canada being having the angel complex, whoops, like Kieran was saying, and have that becoming a blind spot for people, and maybe because there is this idea of not we're better than, say, the US or whatever, that really blinds us to other types of discrimination that happens in Canada. So what else? The idea of biases occurring at a young age was interesting, and how even though that can be a negative, we can also work at that age to reverse those sorts of discrimination and biases. Let's see, what else do we have? And the idea of racism directly affecting mental health. That's a very important part of this. Not only is it physically violence against physical bodies, it can be something that really affects people's well-being in all areas of their holistic lives. I think that's all I'm going to say for now. If you'd just like to take a look at it for a bit.
Thank you. So now is the sort of Q&A part of the session. So I'll ask everyone who's attending, if you had questions, to just post it in the chat. And then we will read it out, and either this, if you have somebody specific you wanted to ask the question to, please indicate that as well. If not, I'll throw it out to the group to see who wants to take the question. So I do want to start off while you're getting your thinking caps on with a question to the students in particular. Is, when you introduced yourself, you clearly demonstrated that you were pretty savvy in terms of the topic and the work related to this topic. But I wondered whether there was anything that surprised you as you were doing the research, something unexpected that came on, or was it pretty much the research sort of demonstrated what you already kind of sensed or felt?
I can.
Oh, sorry.
Do you want me to start, Vanessa?
You can go ahead.
Okay, yeah. I think for me, one thing that I thought was that I hadn't really heard of before, but the project really allowed me to kind of learn about. Vanessa briefly mentioned it, was this idea of brave spaces. I think the term safe space has been used somewhat as a buzzword and kind of all over sort of equity, diversity, and inclusion initiatives. And I never truly understood what necessarily was being communicated when we say safe spaces, and how safe spaces was almost contributing somewhat to the problem of what we were trying to achieve, especially when it comes to race talk. Because the idea, obviously, of brave spaces is really trying to accurately depict what is involved when we actually do have, cross-racial dialogue about race, and the fact that it often is very, uncomfortable on both sides, and it does necessitate a certain level of courage and a certain level of bravery to, be there and be honest about your emotions, be honest about your experiences, and be able to, critically reflect on, your own prejudices and your own biases.
Thank you. Anyone else? Camille?
Yeah, as for me, what really became evident that wasn't before is how prevalent these biases are. You know, going into this project, I kind of upheld this idea that it's better than before. Like, I went to a museum in DC, actually the African American Museum, and the whole setup of it is that you go like up the building, and at the top we're like basically better than like the slave era and all that. And it really, I got the sense that it's better, but you know, the sort of the microaggressions that perpetuate the sort of like lessening of a person in the sense of othering really does go to marginalize a person, in my opinion, to the same extent as before. Like overt and covert are really quite have a similar sort of effect on a person's on a person's sense of marginalization. And another thing that really stuck out to me was how much bias I even hold. And I do want to place this link here. It's called the Harvard Implicit Test. And what you do is you can see how prevalent the sort of biases we have are within us. And what it does is you have to attribute certain words to either a Black person or a white person, and you see how fast you can attribute those words to a certain person. And it just makes it pretty evident how much you have within you. So I'm just going to say this outright, like I do have a lot of work to do too. But I don't blame myself, and we have to be aware of these things and just continually grow. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Vanessa?
Yes, I also wanted to speak on my end of a lot of frustration and anger towards social injustice when I started the project. I actually thought at the beginning that there was a lot of racial segregation in London, but this is not actually true. And I ran the census data twice, and the result was that people in London are actually living together. So it also speaks, and it goes back to what we were talking about critical consciousness and the ability to understand our own biases and to choose fact over assumption. And that was really eye-opener for me. And I was also kind of struck by the idea of social identity development, that we can all grow together and understand those things and become more aware, but also be able to challenge them and to actually act.
For me, on my end, when I was like reviewing our project 0 days ago, I suddenly realized that for me as a visible minority, I didn't really feel any racism, to be honest, during the past 5 years. So thanks for really friendly Canadians, people who are around me. But when we were in the meeting, there's something that just hit me, that sometimes maybe when people are saying something, myself, I didn't realize that that is racist. So the border, like for me to be like polite enough or to be racist, the border is kind of fuzzy for me. And I don't know how to determine whether I am being racist or not. So I think that's something that maybe we can dig into deeper and to see how we can get people noticed and get improved on that point.
Thank you. I think, yeah, I know for me too with this work, it's sort of, this is part of the brave space conversation, is that this will always be, for me, a journey, not a destination. So I'm always unpacking my own biases and learning every time, right? And so I think it makes sense that we are going to be constantly questioning our own selves as we do this work. So thank you. There is a question here. So first, kudos to all the students for your work and how well you presented. I might have missed this part, but who were the individuals that each group consulted with, and how were they recruited? I hear an acronym that sounded like CDS when referring to the group. So I don't know whether Romina or Kinga wanted to do another little quick synopsis on CDIS.
I'm getting the finger. It's the first finger, but that's okay. So yeah, if you missed it at the beginning, how this all kind of links together is that the City of London has a community diversity and inclusion strategy that was developed in 2017. It's community-led strategy, meaning that the people that are doing the work are volunteers who have committed to doing this work on their own time. And so the project is an alignment between CityStudio and with Western University students working with us and doing some of the research that can inform our work. And so it's where the students are connected with a project through the City of London. In this case, it's the Community Diversity Inclusion Strategy, because it aligns so well. So they are part of this is part of their course and part of their material for school, but it also helps inform our work. And so it's CDIS is what you're hearing, the Community Diversity Inclusion Strategy, which is, as I said, we are supported by the City of London. It is their initiative, but it is a fully community-led strategy. I hope that helps.
If I can quickly jump into about the recruitment for the interviews. So how we went about it, we actually submitted an ethics approval to be able to publish this research later on. And all of the volunteers that are involved in CDIS were recruited anonymously. So whoever was interested in participating kind of had to email the professor and they were interviewed. So me as staff, I don't know who was interviewed. So it was basically the volunteers that are working on CDIS that were participating in the interviews.
So there was a question about, are you accepting more volunteers? And I'm reading that question as, are you accepting more volunteers to join CDIS? And I know the short answer is yes. Do you want to sort of quickly explain how to do that?
Sure. So yes, we are accepting volunteers for CDIS on an ongoing basis. All you have to do is go to www.london.ca/CDIS, and there is an online volunteer application which you just submit, and then you just select which working group you want to be part of, and there's a few questions that you would have to answer, and then I'll get in touch with you once I receive your application.
Thank you. There's a question here. Excellent presentation. Several of my white coworkers are surprised that racism exists today. How do we take these concepts away and communicate them to those who wouldn't necessarily seek them out? Also, in regards to microaggressions, any advice on how to call these out in a way that doesn't promote a defensive response? So 2 questions in there. So how do we take these concepts and communicate it to those who won't necessarily seek them out? And I had actually a prep question around that. You know, how do you have this conversation with people who don't want to engage or don't want to, who appear uninterested? And then the second question is, how do you call out microaggressions? So maybe the microaggression question, Kieran, maybe you can take that.
Yeah, no, great question. I kind of briefly touched on, there's actually an article that I can definitely try and see if I can share in the chat that like I got a lot of my information from. But I think, yeah, like the idea of using a non-threatening way is often really, really important because like I said, a lot of times when you do call someone out, they think the first thing is to respond with, again, like you're calling me a racist, and oftentimes that just shuts the conversation down. So I think, again, it's really, really important to, like, in addition to kind of what I already talked about, which is like, again, appealing to the individual that you think they are, somewhat obviously, like we don't want to focus on the intent, but even focusing and saying like, I don't think you intended to do this, but recognize, you know, this is the impact of your actions or this is what you communicated can sometimes be helpful, again, because you're not directly saying that like, you know, like you meant to do this, you are harmful kind of thing. And in addition to doing that, something that I found is particularly helpful too is being vulnerable about your own, you know, missteps and your own, like your own biases and things like that. Because oftentimes I think when someone is called out, sometimes they think that they are isolated in their, you know, activity. And it's important to, you know, let them know that, hey, like, you know, like even me, myself, like I've worked on this project, but I can recognize that I have, you know, perpetuated microaggressions before. And these are things that have been socialized. And so when you are calling someone out, it's really important as well to be like, you know what, hey, like, I understand, like, or like, although you did this, like, you know, like I have done this too, or like I've had experiences, like it's been tough, like I've been through this experience and stuff like that, or I have, you know, similarly thought and done similar things and things like that. And that doesn't mean you're a bad person. It's just, you know, these are things that we have to continuously keep working on. And I think that's like something just to keep in mind, and it helps, you know, like build a little bit of connection when you are having that conversation, because I find that that helps, you know, the message become a little bit clearer and then become a little bit more open to actually, you know, having a discussion about race or having a discussion about their actions and how it's impacting, you know, other individuals. I will, you know, just take a minute to find that article, and I will share it in the chat, because there's a slew of examples of things that, you know, you can really do on an interpersonal level. And I think that will better kind of encapsulate some more ideas.
Thank you. Anyone want to jump in and talk about how do you engage in this conversation when there doesn't seem to be a lot of interest? And very specifically, the reference was to my white coworkers who are surprised that racism exists today. Camille?
Actually, I can take that one.
Oh, yeah. Sorry, who was it?
Oh, sorry, it's me. Camille, if you want to speak, go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to make a point of just saying that, you know, being racist isn't bad only for the victim, but also for the perpetuator. And I think we forget that often. So I think in instances such as that, an indirect approach of going about promoting like anti-racism in the workplace or wherever is to lead by example, because there actually are a lot of benefits that come with fostering connection with people from like diverse backgrounds. And that just comes in a multitude of ways. Just having connection with people from various areas is very beneficial. So by showing first the benefits that come with being inclusive and fostering that community, I think will go a long way in terms of having other people see value in it, because I think that's sort of the problem, that people don't see value in it, and it's not something that's very upheld in our society as important. And other communities around the world that do promote that really have that sense of social justice and care for one another. And I think that's something that we're lacking in this society. So I think leading by example could be a big way of promoting equity inside wherever you are, whether that be the workplace or, yeah.
Great, Vanessa, and then I'll go to you, Kim, if that's okay.
So just to follow up on what Kemi just said, I think we need to meet people where they are, right? We all have different perception or perspective on the topic or on the situation that we are living on our day-to-day life. So I agree definitely to lead by example, but I also feel like sometimes we can maybe push people out of the boundary, for example, by asking them about genuine situation in their day-to-day life, how they feel about that, how they perceive that. I was reading and I was discussing with a friend of mine recently about the fact that outdoors activity, for example, in Canada is a really wide space. We can, for example, you have a newspaper or a situation that's happening as you are doing your jogging in the street or in the morning. Ask your friend, how do you feel about, you know, people or outdoor activity being only reserved or segregated or restricted to white people? So I feel like when we push people's boundary and we allow them to feel comfortable, but also to feel accepted, to have a perspective without calling them racist, they are more comfortable to speak and to engage in those discussions.
Thank you. Kim?
So I just wanted to add that this question is exactly what the class that I run is about. How do we animate the information we have, the things we know about structural racism and the way it affects all of us? How do we place that in front of communities and offer them opportunities to engage and participate in new ways and learn in their bodies? That's really what performance is about at its most core, its most basic form. It's about using your body to learn to inhabit our world in new ways. So although all of our performance actions for this class had to go online because of COVID, initially our goal was actually going to be to have numerous actions and events that would allow audience members to participate. And it's really very much about what Camille and Kieran and Vanessa were saying about inviting people to come with what they have, because we all have internal biases and racist tendencies. We absolutely do. We live in a structurally racist society. It would be a superhuman who didn't have those things, or perhaps an alien who didn't have those things. So it's about coming with all of that, what you have, and then learning to step into a different pair of shoes and experience what it actually means to walk in those shoes. And then you make discoveries in that process. One of the other groups in my class that was working with saneism and mental health issues, their performance piece was an audio walk that took place entirely inside a house and asks participants to listen and to experience what it is like to be in a place of quite deep hurt and deep depression and not be able to leave that space. And for anyone, I know for myself when I was watching it, I grew up in a house where you were told to pull yourself up by your bootstraps when you were feeling blue. For anyone who comes with that predisposition, it's extraordinary to sit with a voice that is telling you, you're not able to get up right now. You're not able to feel okay. So that's the work that we do, and it's at that point, at that question, that my students meet Leora's students, and that we work together on animating the information.
Thank you. I feel like we could unpack what you all just said for the rest of the session, but there are a few more questions. I'm going to read them out. So the next question is, have you found that there is a fatigue around anti-racism? I think it spins off this question that was just asked too. I have a friend who feels that any talk about racism and inclusion disenfranchises him as a white, straight male. Who'd like to take that?
I can take that. So another really big findings through the research is that, because I'm the only yellow person in my group, the all other three people, they're white guy, but they all experienced racism too. So discrimination and racism doesn't only happen on the minority, they're happening on majority too. So it's kind of also a stereotype for the public that, minority suffers a lot, blah, blah, blah. But I want to say that male and white people are suffering, some white people are suffering that too. And some people, they're taking the racist at their advantage to, some people are trying to say, and a healthy argument with, oh, you're racist. So that's another thought we come up with when we're doing our performance, but due to the time limit, we wasn't able to put it inside of our podcast, but that's somehow another interesting findings in the research. And also, me and Kim, we have some go back and forth conversation on this topic. In May and June, because of the George Floyd's event, there's some violent protests happening in the States and somehow in Canada too. And they're holding violent protests in the name of fairness really gave me a new perspective on racism. We think that Mr. Floyd is just a trigger, but what really stops people from enjoying equal rights was the decades-long lag in institutions that has not been approved. And even though we include a call-out action at the end of our podcast, I find it's kind of weak, because you can never wake up a person who pretends to sleep. And maybe when people truly understand why others do what they do will lead to mutual understanding. And people who are treated unfairly under racism are victims, but people who discriminate others against others are also victims of the whole backward system and stereotypes. And some innocent people, due to the butterfly effects or whatever, are also the victims of the long lag system. So I think that can be another starting point for our further projects, and maybe we can have some thoughts on this and make some improvements.
Thank you. Anyone else have a comment?
I just wanted to say something. I think that this goes to stress that it's important that we frame our discussions in a way that's not blaming white people. I think that the big problem with all of this is that we're rationalizing how people are from a certain group based off of media or the way that they're depicted. And I think that it's important that when we talk about, white people or that we separate, you know, the people who have perpetuated these ideals, the colonials, we separate that from current white people, because, you know, even having this discussion with my dad, I can feel there's a tension, because when oftentimes a lot of people, when they talk about these, they facilitate race talk, it's white people have to do this, white people have to do that. But I think it's really important that we just leave it off more on a general note. We talk about, you know, colonials did perpetuate these racial ideals, but we all, as a common humanity, have the same respective role right now, just to reduce those racial, the pervasiveness of like racial, these ideals and stuff. So I think that is very important to remember, just to be aware of the way that you're framing it as well, so that we're promoting a common humanity rather than a bigger divide.
Yeah, I think so. I think I think sometimes this topic, this comes up often in this work, and it, you know, it's the intention is not to blame and shame, as you've talked about already. It's just to realize that the system has been built over centuries to empower one and the hands of the other. And so there's lots of interesting reading out there, including reading around white fragility that might be worth considering as well.
Yeah, can I say something?
Yep.
Yeah, so I just want to add that when we don't, at the same time, we also don't want to be apologetic about how we are expressing it, because the blame or the burden of expressing it or framing it in a certain way doesn't have to fall on the person who is experiencing racism. I know we all agree with that, but I just want to put it out there as well. And also, when someone is, you know, microaggressive, and if somebody doesn't want, a person of color doesn't want to engage with that at that time, there are other ways of directing the person towards a good resource, like art. Art is there to help us, you know, help us navigate these conversations. Also, yeah, another thing that I'm thinking about is how do we think about performative allyship, since the Black Lives Movement, this word has been in the media, and I'm very interested in it. Like, what does it mean to perform allyship, and when does it become bad? Because performing allyship has been good, but recently the term has gained bad currency. Like, performative allyship has become something of a show. So also, yeah, I'm just thinking about how to not do that, but at the same time stand up for a person of color who is experiencing racism.
Thank you. Yeah, that's one thing maybe when we ask about the next iteration of this project that we can speak to as well. I have a question. There's a question here. How do we teach our children, this is coming from a white mom, to not grow up with bias? What is the best way? Tools, resources, suggestions?
So I'll take the reins on that one. I think that there's indirect strategies and direct strategies. So the first one is being aware of your own biases yourself. Children tend to imitate their guardians, especially at the developmental stage, and that's how we kind of learn like what we're supposed to do, how we're supposed to navigate like the social realm. So by showing your acceptance of other cultures in the way that you talk about them or the way that you interact or interact with them, because a huge part of the way that we communicate isn't what we actually say, it's the way that we present ourselves, it's our vocal tone. By embodying cultural competence yourself, your children will take upon those values and mimic it. And as I previously stated, there's also benefits to being culturally competent. Having that sort of diverse community is really, really healthy socially, so they'll see the benefits in that. So the first thing I think is to be aware of yourself and be reflexive yourself, which the link that I previously put up on the chat will help you with that. And the second thing I think is breaking the ice on race talk. You know, we can't ignore the obvious. And so we have to talk about the ways that people are being brought down, whether institutionally, interpersonally. It's important because then the child can be aware of how they can be an ally and how it manifests. Another thing that I thought about was teaching your children to be reflexive of how certain groups of people are being portrayed in the media. Some interventions that I saw composed of, watching a movie. One of the champions actually talked about how she watched Parasite and then went to one of her friends and kind of asked, like, is that an accurate depiction of the Korean community? And I think that's a great way to do it, because we often just we are given these messages and then we just take them to be true. And that's sort of the whole idea of these stereotypes. And we don't really do any further research to see if these are misconceptions or not. So I think that that's a really good activity. And the last thing I think is that, one thing that I considered is that how can you reduce prejudice if you're in an environment where you don't have the ability to be in contact with people of different races, because then that'll lead you to fall back on these stereotypes. And one thing that I looked into in my research was this thing called relational mobility, which is the amount of diverse relationships you can create to your respective environment. And one of the biggest findings they had was that people don't see value in having those like diverse relationships if they're not like grown up in it. They're just like you're used to what you're grown up with. So one thing that I thought would be really cool, and this even applies to some neighborhoods within London. There's some neighborhoods that have a 6% visible minority population. So I think what would be really good for these areas is to facilitate intergroup contact through the internet. And there's a lot of different nonprofits that actually work to create connections between children from across the globe. And I think that's very, very beneficial. I myself was able to have like a sponsor child when I was a kid, and having that interaction with someone, she was in Peru and, Paraguay. And it was just it made me want to take up Spanish. It made me, I think it's a part of the reason why I wanted to do this project today. So I'm going to post that up too. I'm going to post there's a list of cultural competence nonprofits that that are free, and you can set your child up with another child across the globe, and they can just have interaction with each other. And I think that's very, very effective in reducing prejudice and creating that connection that's necessary to reduce the stereotypes that we hold on to. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, and there are neighborhood resource centers too that might offer programming like that, where you can have that opportunity for interaction. So thank you. Okay, here's another one. Great job, everyone. Any thoughts, tips on bringing up this topic as a manager, leader of a team in the workplace? Creating a safe space for sharing and making sure everyone is heard if they would like to share. Vanessa, I think you spoke a little bit to employment, so I might ask you to lead us off on this one.
Okay, thank you very much. I think, Kieran actually mentioned that the difference between brave spaces and safe space. I feel like we are used to this terminology of safe space where everybody feel accepted and they feel respected. It's really important to have those spaces. But when it comes to work like anti-racism work, we need to create those spaces where people are aware and know that they will be challenged and that they will have to overcome that discomfort. So brave spaces allow us to not only have this racial dialogue, but to do this reflexive process on ourselves about how do we perceive things around us? How do we perceive our conflict that we have with a colleague? How do we perceive the institution or the workplace in which we are living? And I feel like those brave spaces also allow us to take a step back on our daily routine and to kind of investigate and analyze by specific topic on a continuous basis how the practices that we have within the organization are equitable or are fair to all everybody. And I feel like also in the workplace, what direct and what kind of influence the culture in the workplace is employees' worldview. So how do we make sure that in those gray spaces, people can bring the worldview and analyze them and see that there are different ways of seeing the world. There are different ways of perceiving how we can do the same work that we are doing right now. And it's only then that we can kind of create an inclusive culture in our organization. I don't know if I answer the question.
You did, I think. Thank you. Anybody else have a comment to add to that?
I can add something just really, really quick. I think, yeah, completely agree with everything that Vanessa was saying. And just from like a more, I think, pragmatic standpoint of like things that can actually be done to start like breaching conversations, I think something that a lot of organizations often do is creating like affinity environments where it is, you know, closed spaces where, you know, certain groups of employees, whether that's racialized, whether that's disabled, whether that's LGBTQ, whatever it is, have the opportunity to come forward and speak on whatever issue it might be. And these environments are often very, very important because just asking someone to come into a room and, you know, talk about their experiences in a company is not very easy when, you know, someone who might be a perpetrator is in the room or something like that. And so it's very, very difficult to just, you know, bring everyone together and say, like, we're going to talk about diversity when, you know, you have to account for the environment that it's happening in. Also, you have to account for the fact that, you know, how people are employed within that environment also impacts, you know, how free they might feel to, you know, share their experiences. You know, we know that, you know, specifically racialized folks are often, you know, the most precariously employed within workplaces and stuff like that. So they don't feel able, this is something that kind of came out in our research as well. They don't feel often able to come forward with, you know, complaints, even if there is anti-oppression or anti-harassment policies and stuff like that, because of their precarious, you know, situation within their employment environments. And so to that, I often say too, like something else that I've been sort of just like researching and thinking more deeply about is also just like anonymous feedback processes and just instituting that. Giving, you know, anonymous means to, you know, just basically give feedback to leadership about, you know, how can we make this space more inclusive that doesn't make, you know, the individual tied to necessarily this feedback, because oftentimes that's a huge hindrance. And that also is also reflective of, you know, what does your organization leadership look like, and how comfortable will someone, you know, if it's a predominantly white environment and stuff like that, how comfortable will, you know, diverse members of your organization feel coming forward with these, you know, complaints or suggestions and things like that.
Vanessa.
I also wanted to add on what Kiran said about practical step that we can actually do is that employees' perception of fairness or diversity inclusion initiative are based usually on their lived experience or the past experience of fairness or equity within the organization. So I feel like we also have to remember that this is a long run process. This is a process that takes time, and we can start with small little things, like Kiran said, like feedback or surveys about the climate within the organization. And we just like, by using those messages, by bringing that, or by feeding that public sentiment within the organization, I feel like it sent a message to the employees that we really want to work on that, and we want to move forward on this topic, but we need to do that in small doses.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that's, I really like both of your points is, you know, that it's a journey, not a destination, you know. And so just because you wake up today and suddenly you say, okay, we're going to be talking about diversity in the workplace, doesn't mean that people who haven't felt safe before are suddenly going to feel safe now that you've just mentioned it. It takes a while to develop those relationships so that you really hear what people have to say. Okay, so I wanted to just ask, well, I'll start off with Romina again, and maybe Kinga, because there's amazing work done on this project. And I know there is a next iteration of it, and I wondered whether you wanted to share with the audience what's happening next.
I'd be happy to do that, but I do have to just do a little pause and say, I don't think I've ever been this quiet on this subject. I am learning so much. I don't know if it's just me, but these guys are amazing. I don't think I ever had that kind of understanding of this topic at that age. So I'm very, very impressed by these guys. And I have to say that, and it excites me because, of course, you're right, we are moving on to school year is starting and we're starting on a new project, and it's very, very fitting with it sort of takes the foundation of what these folks have done, and then we're going to build on the current climate. And so our next project with these the next round of students is very specific to anti-Black racism and anti-Indigenous racism, recognizing in terms of what these folks have told us, you know, that the system has been created in such a way that is very anti-Black and anti-Indigenous in its structure. And so we're going to just start there and understanding those two areas a lot deeper. And then the other piece that we're tacking on, again, very relevant, and I'm really excited about this one because I'm very curious to see the results. We're looking at how COVID-19 has now impacted on marginalized populations, specifically in London. So we kind of know, particularly in North America, that the most marginalized, the most vulnerable people have in fact been impacted by COVID-19 for multiple reasons. And our research will help hopefully confirm what we believe to be true in London as well. That the people that are the social determinants of health are really at play here in terms of how the pandemic has impacted people health-wise, but also in terms of job loss. We often think about, when we talk about diversity and equity in the workplace, we are often talking about hiring and hiring practices and how people come on board. And then sometimes we get into the retention piece sort of around that question that was just asked about how do we do the work when we're in those spaces. But where my curiosity started to go was when something like a pandemic happens, do those biases not also play out in terms of who is let go and who leaves an organization in those situations? And so we're curious to look at the impact of COVID on marginalized populations and how we want to really make that come to life, is to look at it geographically, specifically around neighborhoods, to make it really relevant to, I mean, London, as we know, is made up of 12 neighborhoods, and each neighborhood has different demographics. And someone had spoke about, you know, certain areas where there's a much higher racialized population than others. So what we want to understand is how does that impact on resources, how they are divvied up by the city, what is the access to mental health care, addictions. So how does it play out geographically so that we can better understand and hopefully inform, again, because we are linked with the City of London, there's no way we're going to be doing this work and not help to inform things that happen in that place and space. And so the hope is that the anti-Black, anti-Indigenous, and the COVID-19 impact on marginalized people, all that information will continue to inform the next steps in our work. Our work plan is having to shift, obviously, because of COVID. A lot of our actions were geared to be in person. And so we're in a moment of pivoting anyways. And so it's a natural time for us to hopefully take some of this information, so that's very relevant to the current moment, and then bring it back to life to the City of London in terms of hopefully informing some of their practices based on the research. So I'm super excited about what that is going to teach us as well.
Thank you. Look forward to another presentation of this kind in another year or so. I want to keep a little bit of time to send it back to Sarah. So I'm going to ask one wrap-up question of all the students before we finish up today. If there was one thing you hope people walk away from having learned and that they're going to tell their friends around this topic, what would that be?
For me, it's important that you just start having talk about race, because we carry these biases and we perpetuate, for the most part, unintentional prejudice against others. And you know what I talked about being that we have and manifest these biases as young as 5 years old. it's important to just it gets kind of messy. Like Kieran, Vanessa, and I, we had these discussions, and it was uncomfortable sometimes, but that's important. There's not really a clean way of going about it. You just need to have the discussion. So what I would say to all the listeners is just start it. It's gonna get uncomfortable, but you know, the whole nature of it is to be aware of your own biases and just kind of discuss them. And that seems to be the biggest roadblock for a lot of people, but it's important. And it's important, like Kieran and Vanessa said, that we all sort of hold these and we recognize that we hold them, and we all just, as a humankind, work together to be better for one another. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you. Who'd like, Vanessa?
I think for me, the big takeaway from this whole project is that I'm not alone in this. We are not alone in this. And I think it brings me a lot of comfort because seeing the amazing number of volunteers on the CDIS project, seeing our class even, and seeing after, because when, after the project and after the killing of George Floyd in the state, we were contacted by friends and acquaintances who wanted to know more about the topic. And just seeing that intense desire to learn brings me a lot of comfort that there are actually people who wants to make London a more inclusive space. There are actually people who work day and night with a lot of frustration to make the train go. So it felt really comfortable.
Thank you. I like the train analogy. Yes. Kieran or Chino?
Yeah, okay, I'll go ahead. So for me, I think the biggest thing I want to say is to be brave enough to speak out when you feel you're offended. Because if you don't fight for yourself, you can't put your hope on others to fight for you. So always say it loudly when you feel uncomfortable and let people know that, okay, they may get offended, and fight for your rights. Yeah.
I'm going to reiterate basically what everyone said and just rephrase it a little. I think, and I'm going to say two things just because I couldn't think of just one thing. I think it's really, really important to be disruptive. The system, institutions, and even our own biases really want us to, stay in this, position of inertia. And it's really, really important to acknowledge that, but also acknowledge the value of being disruptive in these spaces, especially as allies. It's extremely important that we are constantly orienting ourselves towards, anti-racism and justice and things like that, because at the heart of it, we are the ones, especially white allies, that are benefiting off of this system and the current complacency of it. And so really change has to involve us. It should not be led by us, but it needs to involve, and we do need to support it. And in that as well, I want to say that, again, it is a collective struggle. It is a collective fight. Learning and educating yourself is great, but it doesn't mean anything until you're able to do that in a group, find your group that can, really catalyze action in your neighborhood or your school or your region and things like that, because it's really important that, really to uproot systems and to uproot our institutions and really to force action. It takes a collective. It won't happen just by one individual becoming now enlightened and critically conscious. It needs to involve all of us. And so moving forward, I really just encourage you to find those people who are ready to learn with you. And even those people who aren't, just take those everyday steps to try and get them there.
Great. Awesome. Great advice. I'm going to hand it back to you, Sarah, for to speak to your graphic recording. And I know all of this will be posted, but any quick comments that you might have.
I think there are lots of really great nuggets of wisdom here, and I grabbed a few, but overall I think this pretty much speaks for itself. There's a lot of really good takeaways. Being disruptive, being conscious and of how other people might perceive situations, and being empathetic to those different views, different perceptions, and being okay to be uncomfortable in situations as well is it's the only way to move forward, to grow as a person. And I think overall, I think there's a lot of really great advice, and hopefully people can take it to heart and move forward with it.
Thank you. As always, I'm completely amazed by what can be accomplished by a graphic artist. It just looks fantastic. I can't wait to look at it more closely. So as a wrap up, first and foremost, I echo Romina's comments in terms of the presentations today. So if you wanted to see why CityStudio projects are so awesome, this is a great example of what you can get from the caliber of the work that we saw today. So thank you all to all four of you for being available to present today. There are links and things that have been in the chat that will be shared out with everyone, as well as go on the CityStudio website that will host this webinar, the recording of this, and a report of the project. Yeah, so anything related to that will be there. We do want to do a call out both for CDIS that some of you may have heard of for the first time, always looking for volunteers. Kinga spoke to going on the city website. I believe the link was on there in terms of signing up. I happen to be a community member on this particular strategy as well, and it's a very rewarding experience. Join CityStudio and follow up online and think about projects that might be relevant. I have a note here. Vanessa, is there a project you wanted to share?
Yes, I just wanted to share about, as Karen mentioned, to start those little action in our own space. So collectively, we started a support group, which is mostly a brave space. It's called Beloved, and it stands for Believe, Engage, Love, Own, Direct, and Educate. So basically, it's a brave space where people like us who really desire to learn more, but also to grow into this entire racism work, can come and share with other people and learn together, and through storytelling, but also for those who are still marginalized and I still feel like I'm under oppression, can start this work of healing and decolonization. So yeah, so it's just also echoes to the call to action that yeah, we can do it in so many different ways, and we just need to find people around us who are like-minded and who wants to do the same work.
Thank you. Misha, is there anything I have left out that you wanted to add before we close out?
No, just thank you to you, Darcy, for holding us today in this beautiful conversation, and thanks everybody for joining and for all of the work. We're really looking forward. We'll be working hard on our end to pull all of this together onto the project page, all the links that were shared today, all the tools and resources. So we'll get all of that on the project page, so that's in one useful spot for you, and you'll get an email as well with those links next week. So thank you very much.
Yeah, and I'll add my thanks to everybody who attended the session today, everyone else on the panel today that was here, and thank you, and have a good rest of the week, everyone.